Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show on GB News. I'm delighted to be joined now by the former Home Secretary Suella Braverman, MP for Fareham, in the studio, live and dangerous. No, not necessarily. It's interesting because I haven't actually spoken to you at length since your resignation. Let's just go back to that moment if we can, because it's still probably fresh in people's memories. I mean, you were quite critical of Rishi Sunak and the government in your resignation letter. I suppose the general impression that people were given was that you might have been, I appreciate you resigned, but you might have been forced out because you were too right-wing.
Actually, I think that is my assessment of it, actually, or too honest. You know, I approach the role as Home Secretary as a privilege. It's always a privilege to take these jobs. And I wanted to make a difference. I really wanted to do what was necessary to stop the boats, because I know the British people really care about that. I really wanted to limit legal migration. I really wanted to improve policing. And I saw it as an opportunity to be really honest for the British people, even if that was going to be difficult, even if that might make me unpopular. And I think that jarred with the Prime Minister, and ultimately we had too many disagreements on policy, whether it was relating to migration, policing or other matters. And so, you know, a working relationship can't really survive in those circumstances.
I mean, it was kind of preluded by a pretty difficult week for you. You were criticised for your comments about homelessness, sort of likening it to a lifestyle choice. You were criticised for saying that the police had played favourites when it came to the pro-Palestinian marches. Do you regret any of that in hindsight?
Well, what I would say is, I mean, I didn't say that homelessness is a lifestyle choice.
That for us.
What I actually said was that people who are homeless require a huge amount of compassion and support. And that's why I'm really proud that we have a massive package of holistic resources to help people who fall on hard times and who need support to get back on track with their lives, whether it's to deal with their mental health problems, to deal with addiction problems, to deal with housing or employment matters. But there's also an element that we can't shy away from, which is that there's a cohort of people who are refusing offers of accommodation by the council. So are you saying that they
are therefore choosing to be homeless?
Who are using tents for criminality, such as prostitution or drug dealing, and who are causing antisocial behaviour and criminality in their communities. I've seen it in my community, in my constituency. The council has worked for years to try and get these people off the streets, offers of accommodation repeatedly, offers of help, refused time and time again. And in those circumstances, a firm but fair approach is needed. And I think that's another example of where honesty can sometimes get you into trouble. I
mean, with regard to the police, is it right for a Home Secretary to be that critical of the police and how they're carrying out operations, the Met?
Well, again, I don't think I actually did, interfere in any operational decisions.
Playing favourites, you still stand by that? Do you think they are playing favourites and that they're favouritising, I guess, pro-Palestinians over Jews and Israelis?
Well, what we've seen, and let's look at the facts, is now months of hateful marches taking place as a regular fixture on the streets of Britain. We've seen people chanting jihad and the police turning a blind eye.
There's very many different reasons for explanations for jihad, apparently.
That was a low point for me when the Met Police came out and justified the chanting of jihad. They had some people who were extremists actually advising them in the heart of their team. We've seen London and other cities become no-go areas for Jewish people now on a regular basis. We've seen flagrant and brazen anti-Semitism, which has now become normalised.
So should these marches have been stopped? Should they be stopped? You've got this sort of tug of war going on, as far as I can tell, between the Met Police saying, oh, well, we can't stop them, and the government saying, yeah, you can, you have got the power. Have they got the power to stop them?
Yes. The law is very clear that this is a decision that has to be initiated by the Met Police. And so when I was Home Secretary, I was in a real tussle with the police.
So you're saying to Mark Rowley, you've got to stop these marches, and he's saying what?
I made it clear that my view was that the march should not have gone ahead on Armistice Day. That day of deep reverence, national significance, was almost sacrosanct.
But in general, I mean, is there an argument to say, look, you've made your point now, you shouldn't be marching at all?
I think, actually, there is a case for giving ministers, the Home Secretary, more powers to ban a march. What happened was I was powerless in law. I didn't have a power to ban that march on Armistice Day. It was down to the Met Police. I believe they made the wrong decision. I said so
But we've heard this quite a lot. I mean, even under Cressida Dick's reign, this idea that the police and the Home Office are somehow at loggerheads. Is that the reality of the situation at times?
Actually, no. I had a very good working relationship with the police. And I'm pro-police. Except on that issue, I felt I needed to speak up for the British people and be honest about it. I backed the police with one of the largest pay settlements that they got. I backed the police on improving their powers when it came to disciplining rogue police officers. I increased their powers when it came to protesters and militant disruptors on our streets. So I was pro-police as a Home Secretary, but I also felt that the quid pro quo for that was also to challenge them when they were getting it wrong.
Have you spoken to Rishi Sunak since you left office?
That's a good question. I don't think so, no.
And in your resignation letter, you talked about someone needing to be honest. Your plan is not working. We have endured record election defeats. Your resets have failed and we are running out of time. You need to change course urgently. What does that mean, change course? Change leader? I mean, what did you make, for instance, because it was almost like your resignation letter was a forerunner for Simon Clarke's op-ed in The Telegraph last week calling for Sunak to step down and be replaced. Does he need to step down and be replaced?
The Prime Minister's not going anywhere. Rishi Sunak's going to be leading us into the general election. But what I do believe strongly is that, and every poll that we see day after day is confirming it, is that we're heading to an almighty defeat. I'm very concerned about that. We are at this stage going to lose a lot of brilliant Tory MPs, and I'm very worried about that. I believe the Prime Minister does need to change course. I believe he needs to.
And do what, though, exactly?
So, for example, on the Rwanda bill, I believe that he needed to introduce a law that would actually work, that would actually do what was necessary. Might be difficult or controversial, but necessary to block off the claims from people that prevent us from deporting them, deal with the European Court of Strasbourg and human rights, which has stopped us from sending flights to Rwanda. Unfortunately, and we tried strenuously to improve the bill, the Prime Minister refused our attempts.
Why do you think that he refused your attempts?
You'd have to ask him.
What's your interpretation of events?
I think that, you know, there's a sense in government that we have to compromise and tweaking is sufficient.
Why do you think the government needs to compromise? Are they kowtowing to the One Nation caucus? Does he think that your attempts to strengthen the bill are too right-wing? What's the truth of this?
I mean, I think that, what we were proposing to the Rwanda bill was to exclude individual claims, pretty much, totally, and then also prevent the Strasbourg court from actually blocking flights from taking off. That would have been somewhat controversial amongst the international community, amongst certain sectors, the legal community, for example. And I think that there's a sense that we don't want to upset certain groups.
I mean, is there an argument, and it's a little bit sort of shades of Brexit, but that a bill is better than no bill?
I would have said that a few years ago, but we're now on our third bill. We passed the Nationality and Borders Act, and that fell short and didn't work. We passed the Illegal Migration Act. I introduced that. I had to accept compromises, and I'm afraid that's fallen short. We've now introduced a third bill, and I'm afraid it won't stop the boats. It won't fix this problem because it falls short, and I wasn't willing to bite my tongue on another occasion and just wave this thing through.
So when this bill comes back to the Commons, how will you vote?
Well, I've already voted against it.
So you predict
So I've lodged my opposition to it. I don't believe it will work, and I'm not willing to be complicit in a sham. I believe that the British people deserve better.
So you'll vote against?
I don't know how I'll vote in subsequent matters. I think that's actually immaterial. I've taken the very difficult decision to vote against it at third reading. I think that's a very strong sign of my concerns about the bill. And I think, it's going to go through ultimately. And, time will tell whether it's going to be a success or not.
When Sir Simon Clarke went over the top, so to speak, were you cheering him on or having grave reservations about what he did?
Listen, I didn't know that Simon was going to say what he was going to say. And I have a huge amount of respect and admiration for Simon. He's an incredibly brave and, again, plain-speaking and honest politician. He's also one of the nicest people you'll meet in Parliament.
That sounds quite supportive of him, then, because he obviously got a lot of flack from other Tories in WhatsApp groups saying, you know, this was absolute madness. You can't replace a Prime Minister now, this close to the next general election. I mean, what do you think? Can you replace a Prime Minister this close to the next general election?
As I said, I think that's a pointless question. That's not going to happen.
No, I'd like an answer to it, though.
Rishi Sunak's going to be our Prime Minister into the next general election.
OK.
But what I do admire about Simon was his courage to speak out about a lot of the anxieties that many Tory MPs are feeling privately, many of our members feel, many of our supporters feel, which is a real anxiety about the state of the polls. We've got an open goal when it comes to fighting Labour. We're up against Keir Starmer, a man who has absolutely no principles whatsoever, who changes his mind on policy matters more than he changes his socks, who has no charisma, who would undo Brexit, who would open our borders to millions of migrants from the EU. And we're 20 points behind him.
Well, what do you put that down to? Because you've talked about Rishi Sunak's distinctive style of government, but equally perhaps you think that the Conservatives need to take the gloves off and take the fight to Labour more and be more aggressive.
Absolutely. I really feel that we should, on migration, for example, have chosen the tough, hard-headed and necessary measures on the Rwanda bill and actually force Labour to oppose our measures. I think on legal migration, again, the Prime Minister has resisted my attempts. For a year, I pleaded with him. We need a cap.
So are you saying that if the Rwanda bill comes back, not least if it's been amended in the Lords and all the rest of it, it hasn't been strengthened as you and Robert Jenrick and other colleagues had advised, you're saying that the boats won't stop and that we will continue to have a situation where foreign judges can sort of overturn domestic legislation?
I'm afraid that is my diagnosis after having served as Home Secretary, Attorney General and also worked in the field of immigration law for a decade as a barrister. This bill, it may get a token flight off here and there, but in order to actually deliver a deterrent effect, we need a large number of flights taking off regularly with a high number of passengers.
But then this isn't helpful, is it, to, as you say, a Prime Minister who's tanking in the polls? We saw from a Ipsos Mori survey in the week that only 20% of voters are satisfied with him compared to the 31% that were satisfied with John Major before 1997, and we know how that turned out. But then campaign director Isaac Levidow has said, I think probably quite wisely to Tory MPs, it's a case of unite or die. So you have to unite, don't you? And yet we hear, you know, your caucus of MPs on the right and others are constantly agitating. Perhaps you could argue that you're the wreckers here. You're the ones making it difficult for Rishi Sunak.
Listen, I think genuine disagreements on policy and expressing those disagreements is what a politician's job is. That's not infighting or disunity. I can't slavishly support something I fundamentally disagree with.
Yeah.
The British people deserve more than that. They deserve honest politicians. And I've tried as Home Secretary and I'll continue being honest for the British people, telling them where things are going wrong, urging the government to change course, because I want this Conservative government to win. I want us to beat Keir Starmer and I want us to deliver for the British people on migration, on policing, on extremism, on public safety.
What's the price of honesty, though? Because we've seen in the week Mike Freer having to stand down as the MP for Golders Green. He said he'd received death threats. I know you have a huge amount of abuse on social media. What's the current situation as far as you're concerned? Have you got more abuse since you stepped down? What's life like? Do you receive death threats?
Personally, I would say that on Mike Freer, I think it's a damning indictment on our society that one of the most upstanding and honourable members of our government and parliament has been hounded out of office because of Islamism and extremism, anti-Semitism and homophobia.
But have you been on the receiving end of similar threats?
Of course.
And still now? I mean, more than ever? Or?
Yes, on a daily basis.
And how do you cope with that?
Listen, I am... unfortunately, it is the bread and butter of life in the public eye.
But do you have to have protection now? Because I know you leave office and you don't necessarily have protection. Have you had to retain some?
I have, yes.
Did you expect to have to do that?
No, usually Home Secretaries lose their personal protection when they leave office, but I have been assessed, and I'm very grateful to the parliamentary authorities who have afforded me ongoing protection.
Let's just talk about this case involving this chemical attack in Clapham. I suppose the first question on people's lips is, how do we have a situation where somebody is convicted of a crime, in this case a sex crime, and is still allowed to seek asylum in this country? Would you like to see, I know the current rule is that if you're found guilty of something and you're put in prison for a year or more, your asylum claim can be reversed and indeed you can be deported. But shouldn't we just have a blanket rule that if you're found guilty of any crime above a fixed penalty notice, you're out, you're sent home?
I agree, actually, and I think that this case illustrates major failings, and we need to wait for the review to confirm exactly what's gone wrong. But I think there are two elements here. There's the fact that we had a convicted sex offender who was allowed to stay in the country. We need to overhaul the rules relating to that. And secondly, I think the Church has many questions to answer about the role that they've played.
I mean, presumably this explosion in people at the last minute seemingly converting to Christianity did happen while you were Home Secretary, as well as in recent times. It's not just this case, but we've read of another couple in the papers this morning. What's going on here? Should people be allowed to claim Christianity as a reason for staying in the UK?
Well, I should say this person was granted asylum before I was Home Secretary. But what we've seen and what I became aware of was many churches around the country facilitating bogus asylum claims, effectively rubber stamping people who turn up to church and say they want to convert to Christianity, and that would be something that could bolster their asylum claim.
So what should be done? I mean, there may well be some people who have legitimately converted to Christianity and they do legitimately fear persecution if they return to their home country. How can we crack down on this? How can we police this?
Well, when I was Home Secretary, I set up a dedicated task force to look at some of the dubious practices that are going on to enable bogus asylum claims, whether it's dodgy lawyers who facilitate fraudulent claims, whether it's other so-called professionals enabling this sordid business. And with more reporting, more investigations and tougher enforcement, they can be rooted out. And we did see a few results in that work. I urge the government to continue in earnest. But I do think as well, this thing about the Church and what we've seen over the last few days raises serious questions about the rigour with which the Church is applying their processes. It's also a gross insult to those genuine Christians who are devout and take their faith seriously when they see people traipse through the church getting their certificate of verification or their letter from the priest only to disappear and get asylum granted. I think it's a very, very sad state of affairs.
I know you've also been critical of people like Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, sort of intervening on the Rwanda bill. Just in a one-word answer, should the clergy be intervening when it comes to political matters like Rwanda?
Listen, everyone can express themselves, but I do think that in some of these very important debates where issues like national security, public safety, border control are raised, that
should Welby be commenting, yes or no?
A bit more deference to government and executive decision-making is expected.
Let's just end on your own leadership hopes, if you still have them. There's a More in Common poll out today suggesting that Penny Mordaunt is the favourite to replace Rishi Sunak if or when the time comes. It says here, in a blow to Suella Braverman, a poll found that she is highly polarising. While 25% of 2019 Tory voters said she would make a good leader, beating Kemi Badenoch by 1 point, 53% said she would make a bad leader. Do these sorts of polls affect your sort of future hopes of one day leading the Tory party?
Goodness, listen, I served as Home Secretary. I'm grateful for that opportunity. I'm here really to champion conservative values.
But does that mean at the helm one day?
Well, I'm not going to make any comment on what might happen in the future.
But you're not ruling it out, I can tell.
There's no leadership election. What we do face is a general election. At the moment, we're heading for an almighty defeat. My objective is to do whatever it takes to avert that. And I want to encourage the Prime Minister to change course.
Whatever it takes, though.
Yeah, I want us to adopt some policies
mean? Potentially
that stop
a leadership
the boats.
challenge?
Oh, no, absolutely not. No. I mean, listen, there is going to be no leadership challenge to Rishi Sunak before the general election. He's heading us, unfortunately, right now to a defeat. We need to do everything we can to avoid that. Let's get some policies that actually deliver for the British people, lowering migration, stopping the boats, getting some common sense policing, and actually restoring Britain to the rightful place that it deserves.